Hanse, I'm Creeson Agecoutay. Welcome to APTN National News. A federal court judge has dismissed a court challenge by the Innu Nation. The Innu leaders asked the federal court to review a memorandum of understanding between the federal government and the Innu Community Council in Labrador. Here's Annette Francis with more.
The 68-page decision was released yesterday, and so far both parties are claiming a win. Todd Russell, a former Liberal MP, is the president of Nunatuavut, or NCC, the defendants of this case.
This win was an affirming win, that in fact we do have a strong, on the face of it, case for Aboriginal rights. And so we want to be at a table to be able to give expression to those rights, to talk about what our needs and priorities are for our communities. And this court decision certainly paves the way for that to happen.
The NCC represents over 6,000 members who claim to be Inuit in Labrador. The Innu Nation filed for a judicial review of the Memorandum of Understanding the Liberals signed in 2019 between the NCC and former Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett. At that time, Innu Nation Chief Simon Poku said recognition of the NCC, who do not have Section 35 rights, is a threat to his nation.
A group who call themselves NCC, that they want to take our rights, they want to take our lands.
According to the court decision, the MOU is an agreement only. It does not recognize the NCC as an Aboriginal people under Section 35. Matt McPherson is a lawyer for the Innu Nation.
The decision confirms what Innu Nation wanted confirmed for all of the worlds to know and to be clear on, which is that the Nunatuavut Community Council, or NCC, has never been recognized as an Aboriginal people under the Constitution, and they have never been recognized as having Section 35 rights.
Russell firmly maintains his organization legitimately holds Section 35 Indigenous rights.
I would say with all confidence that there is no other group in Canada, certainly not in Eastern Canada or Northeast Canada, that has such a strong prima facie case to Aboriginal rights as the Nunatuavut Inuit. I would also say that we are in a very, very strong legal position, as this win is one of many that we have had in the courts.
Russell says after 5 years, it's now up to the federal government to make a commitment to get back to the table with the NCC. McPherson says the MOU has no legal effect in the Innu Nation and will continue to protect their rights.
Innu Nation will be watching what Canada is doing with NCC very closely and continuing to aggressively advocate to ensure that Innu Nation's rights and Innu Nation's, 8,000-year plus existence in Labrador is not threatened by a group of settlers who are pretending to be something that they're not.
Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The federal government recently acknowledged that the Lake Manitoba-Lake St. Martin Outlet Channels project would cause significant harm to surrounding Indigenous communities. Now the Interlake Reserve's Tribal Council is calling on the province to follow suit and drop the project. APTN's Sarah Bettens has the story.
This is not going to be any different with this channel. Historically, it's gotten worse every time, and that same thing we believe will happen with this channel. It's not going to save us from flooding. It's going to continue to make us the sacrifice for Manitoba.
Treaty 2 leaders were in Winnipeg to bring attention to the harm they say will be caused by the Lake Manitoba-Lake St. Martin Outlet Channels project. The project was proposed to prevent future flooding by creating two 24-kilometer-long flood diversion channels. Last week, Federal Environment Minister Sigvio Bo jumped on the bandwagon with the chiefs. He said the provincial plan would cause foreseeable harm. Now, the Interlake Reserve's Tribal Council is calling on the province to do the same.
We're hopeful that moving forward, the Government of Manitoba's water management strategy includes us in being part of that strategy, as well as taking our status as important rights holders, our inherent rights and treaty rights, into consideration while pragmatically moving forward on projects profoundly impacting our communities and way of life.
In April, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada said the Outlet Channels project could cause damage to the physical and cultural heritage of the First Nations. At the Thursday press conference, AMC Grand Chief Kathy Merrick said Manitoba has a duty to consult them and put First Nations leadership at the center of environmental projects like this one.
First Nations must take the lead on these environmental impact assessments. They must be the decision makers over the use of their lands and their territories, that their citizens have been stewards of long before the federal and the provincial governments were created.
They also underscored the impact flooding has had on their communities 13 years after diverting water away from Winnipeg, displacing tens of thousands of band members. To this day, some are unable to return home.
So the roads right now in Lake St. Martin that people, our elders, like to go back there and visit where they grew up, but they can't now because of the road. The road was washed out.
The Interlake Tribal Council says the Outlet Channels project will only cause more problems. Carl Zadnik is the council's CEO. He suggests something more sustainable.
To capture the floodwater and then, I guess put it through osmosis or some kind of system that would refine the water so that could be used and maybe reallocated to people of need that are going through drought. So it's a little more expensive, but again, it's more futuristic thinking in terms of green energy and climate change.
Lake Manitoba Chief Cornell McLean said the Tribal Council is scheduled to meet with the province on July 18th to discuss a way forward. Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
At the annual gathering of the Grand Economic Circles of Indigenous Peoples in Quebec, the key subject of discussion was economic reconciliation. Agecoutay Vayet Chizo reports what that means for First Nations and the future of their relationships with the Quebec government.
Quand on a parlé de notre plan ambitieux pour le Québec en matière énergétique, il y a plusieurs communautés qui ont levé la main, qui ont dit, nous, on veut être des partenaires, on ne veut pas être laissés de côté.
The 2024 annual gathering of the Grand Economic Circle of Indigenous Peoples and Quebec recently took place in Montreal.
Je trouve que c'est un bel exemple de partenariat, un bel exemple de concret. Ce qu'on fait ici, non seulement ce que vous avez discuté à l'intérieur des rencontres, mais tout ce qui se passe dans les corridors.
The gathering was launched 3 years ago to strengthen First Nations socio-economic development and economic reconciliation.
C'est un thème que tu entends partout, mais nécessairement, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Je pense que même nous, les Premières Nations, on ne sait pas trop. Mais on se rend compte que finalement, on en fait au day-to-day, dans nos partenariats, dans ce qu'on veut faire comme entente. Mais là, c'est comment qu'on va plus loin.
Jennifer Obomsawin completed the leadership certificate with the First Nations Executive Education Initiative last year. That program is part of the Montreal Business School, HEC, which hosted this year's networking activities at the Grand Circle.
Je pense que ça permet, pour une des rares fois, de se dire, bon, mais fondamentalement, c'est-tu la bullshit, ce qui se passe ou c'est vrai? Puis comment qu'on l'incarne, nous, dans le day-to-day?
She believes economic reconciliation requires a debate to shake up the system. Ian Lafrenière, the minister responsible for relations with First Nations and Inuit, says it's more important to give First Nations a reason to join the existing system.
On veut que les membres des Premières Nations, les Inuits, les communautés soient des partenaires dans nos projets, pas juste avoir une redevance, pas juste redonner un montant financier relié à ça, vraiment les avoir comme des partenaires.
Il faut que nous acceptions la réalité que nous avons fait des erreurs. Donc ça, c'est un point de départ.
Michael Sabia, CEO of Hydro-Québec, speaks candidly about the Crown Corporation's historical conflicts with First Nations.
L'idée commence avec l'importance de reconnaître le passé, de reconnaître les histoires des Premières Nations, mais également de reconnaître les erreurs que nous avons fait à Hydro-Québec.
Ghislain Picard, chief of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec-Labrador, says the new approach is a welcome one for communities. But he insists on the need for transparency.
Au minimum, les Premières Nations ont besoin de savoir où ce gouvernement de la Coalition Avenir Québec veut les amener.
Lawyer Ken Rock, co-founder of the First Nations Executive Education Program, says the conference reflects progress towards economic autonomy.
Ce qu'on retient aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on est dans la bonne voie.
Obomsawin also sees hope for the future.
En quelque sorte, je pense que les Premières Nations sont passées de représenter un coût dans une opération à créateur de richesse. Ce changement de perception-là, je trouve ça beau de voir ça. Puis aujourd'hui, ça l'incarne. On voit qu'il y a un rapport de force différent, les relations sont différentes. On n'est pas aux dépens d'eux ou au crochet d'eux.
It remains to be seen whether the discussions will provoke the significant changes she feels are needed for economic reconciliation. Kijate Alexandra Veyachizo, APTN National News, Montreal.
A statue in honor of Indigenous veterans has made its way home in Normandy, France. That story when we return. We'll be back in about 3 minutes. Welcome back. To France now on a story we showed you last week, where some members of Pipekisi's Cree Nation in Saskatchewan traveled to Juno Beach to witness the official unveiling of a statue dedicated to the Royal Regina Rifles. As CTV's Rhonda Nye reports, many from that reserve volunteered to put their lives on the line for our freedom.
Alan Bird's father, Charles, was a Regina rifleman from Pipekisi's Cree Nation, who fought alongside many Indigenous soldiers from across Canada in World War II.
They came to a place, to a beach that was very traumatic for many of them, very scary, to land into a battle that was beyond their comprehension of that day. And only a handful were fortunate to make it to that wall.
Arlene Johnson traveled to France with her sister to honor their father, Edward Bellegarde, as well as their uncle, Vincent.
We are so grateful for the many brave soldiers that heeded the call, even though through treaty they were not required to enlist. They chose to because it was the right thing to do.
They were part of a group from Pipekis invited to the official unveiling of a statue dedicated to the Royal Regina Rifles that now sits in its permanent home about 20 kilometers away from Juno Beach, where the riflemen arrived on D-Day.
Seeing all the people here today, seeing all the uniforms, seeing Princess Anne, and all the people here today to come and honor this monument here today, it was a good feeling in my heart.
Johnson says the statue proves that Pipekis is the home of warriors.
It has only recently become common knowledge that First Nations people contributed in significant numbers to the conflicts of war without much recognition. I am overcome with emotion to see this statue and know that there is a permanent marker to show that we were there and that we mattered.
Adding, if it were not for their efforts, our world today could look a whole lot different. For Indigenous Circle, I'm Rhonda Nye in Normandy, France.
Throughout June, APTN News Online has been sharing poems as part of our Indigenous History Month anthology series. Today's poem comes from Carolyn Morgan, reading her poem titled Bannock Bake and how making it means so much more to her.
Bannock Bake. I do not measure my flour. I do not measure anything, and so I'm afraid I cannot teach you. You'll have to watch as I did, watch and feel. The amount of flour doesn't matter. I empty it straight from the bag, wait for the plume of dust to settle. It covers the countertops, dulls the shelves. Everything looks unclean. I add about 4 palms worth of baking powder, a pinch of salt, use the backs of my fingers to mix the dry, then wipe my hands clean on the sides of my pants. Do not tell the ancestors that I also use yeast. That is the secret, blooming the yeast in warm water until it is frothy, then add it to the dry. My excuse is my colonized mind. My excuse is I do not know better. I do not know anything. I use hot water for mixing, which vexes your grandfather. When we make bake, he says, you use ice water. Ice water always, never hot. He feels we are thieving something when we make the bannock, refuses to believe that they are the same, that the bannock and the bake filled starved bellies, the bellies of the enslaved and the bellies of the enfranchised. It was the gift of our captors, and we used it to gain strength. I carry this hunger in my cells. You carry this starvation memory that we brag about at powwows. Who makes the best fry bread? At potlucks, who fries the best bake? I add creamed coconut, grated from the block, when we are having buljow, and I leave it out when there's moose to stew. For both, I fry in cast iron, I fry in Crisco. I do not measure, just pull handfuls of dough from the mound and flatten it on the countertop, lay it in the oil. I use a fork to turn it. I salt it the second it comes off the pan. Bannock is best dipped in soup. Bake, stuffed with shark meat, onion, and cilantro.
Thank you, Carolyn. And we have our poll results from this week's questions that we asked our viewers. We asked, are you seeing an increase in youth-related crime where you live? 57% said yes, 22% said no, and 21% said unsure. Our next question was, should Indigenous graduates be allowed to incorporate cultural items in their cap and gowns? And 86% of you agree that Indigenous graduates should be allowed to incorporate cultural items to their cap and gowns, while 10% said no and 4% said unsure. And lastly, we were curious on how much your monthly household cell phone bill is. 41% said under $60, 29% said between $60 and $120, 18% said between $120 and $180, and 11% said over $180. That 41% of people, give me a call. I need to know, I need to get a bill under $60 here. The first ever All Indigenous Film Festival happened in Saskatchewan last week. We'll bring you some of the highlights when we return. Over on the East Coast, Charlottetown 18, Halifax 19 in rain. La Grande River 19, Innu 8 with rain there. Val d'Or 19, Saguenay 16. London 25, Ottawa 21. Sioux Lookout 25, Timmins 23. Churchill 14, Thompson 21 with rain. Winnipeg 23, Dauphin 26. Swift Current 28, Saskatoon 25. Stony Rapids 23, La Ronge 19 with rain. Fort McMurray 21, Peace River 12 with rain. 23, Calgary, Medicine Hat 21. Tofino 14, Kamloops 22. Dease Lake 16, Smithers 16. Beaver Creek 19, Mayo 20. Wrigley 22, Yellowknife 19. Nuvik 16, Colville Lake 14. Baker Lake 7, Chesterfield 7 as well. Iqaluit 4, Igloolik 2. Last weekend, the first All-Indigenous Film Festival to be held in Saskatchewan took place in Saskatoon. With 70 short films and 10 full-length films, the festival had a movie for everyone. Video journalist Rachel May has more.
Our Maternal Home is a family story that is about fostering healing through reconnection, walking the land, and also honoring through food.
Director Janine Windolf has her film, Our Maternal Home, featured in the first ever Achimoan Film Festival. The festival celebrates Indigenous culture, language, and tradition through film. Windolf was born in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, but her journey to learn of her maternal roots led her to Waswanipi, Quebec, where her grandmother was raised. Windolf said not only did she learn about her grandmother, but she also connected with a new part of herself.
So it was like piecing together the younger grandmother that I didn't know, and then having like the funny stories about her humor, and that really helped me understand how I can connect to her, because she passed on when I was 11.
Agecoutay Festival Director Tristan Greyeyes says the inspiration for the festival came from New Zealand.
I was inspired by their Indigenous Film Festival over there. It's very community driven, and it was just so beautiful because it was cultural and traditional and had their Indigenous language.
There were over 110 Indigenous films submitted for the event, but only 80 made the cut. Greyeyes hopes to run the festival every 1 to 2 years. To help youth pursue their dreams of having their films featured on the big screen one day, she has created the Agecoutay film programming.
And we're going to be bringing in Indigenous filmmakers that are established within the industry to come and run those programs, and then by the end of the 2-week programming, we're going to have those films made by those Indigenous youth screening in their communities.
6 Indigenous communities across Saskatchewan will be selected to receive this programming, which is expected to start in August. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
The Assembly of First Nations is the top rung of First Nations governance in Canada, but behind closed doors, the organization has been plagued by infighting and power struggles over the years. Tomorrow night on an all-new episode of APTN Investigates, journalist Christopher Reed looks at some of the challenges facing Indigenous governance from pre-contact to today. Here's a preview.
Colonization tried, but failed to eliminate the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And Leroy Hill knows that because he's part of it.
My name is Hohahis Leroy Hill. I'm the council secretary for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'm also a faith keeper, and I'm a teacher of language and also a student of our history and our traditions.
We met at the Confederacy's old council house, built in 1863, 4 years before Canada was founded.
Well, they built this for our government to meet here. Councils functioned here pretty peacefully for quite a while before the Indian Act experiment was imposed.
It was at this location in 1924 that the traditional government of the Haudenosaunee first read and rejected the Indian Act.
They held a meeting for days and days. We have minutes of it. The discussion, and they went through section of that Indian Act, and they said, this sounds good, but we reject it because of this. And they went through every section that I first drafted the Indian Act, and as a united group, the General Indian Council it was called, they sent 6 nations back to tell the federal government, the Crown, that we reject it, and the reasons are enclosed from our minutes.
We'll have to check that out this weekend. And that's your midday newscast for this Friday, June 14th. Dennis Ward will be back for your evening national newscast in a few hours. From our HQ in Winnipeg and from our reporters across the country, we thank you for watching and have a good and safe weekend.